CVI visual behaviors. Let's explore the unique visual behaviors associated with CVI to help you better understand how much CVI impacts our children and to help you recognize the signs of CVI. First, let's talk about vision. Vision is built in the brain. Our eyes and brains need to work together to see the world around us. The eye receives the image and sends information to the primary visual cortex in the back of the brain, which starts to interpret that image and sends that information to the brain's visual processing pathways. The dorsal visual pathway runs from the occipital to the parietal to the frontal lobes and is known as the WARE or vision for action pathway. The dorsal stream helps with finding items in space, visual motor skills, spatial orientation, and visual attention. The ventral visual pathway runs from the occipital to the temporal lobes and allows for fine detail vision, visual recognition, object identification, and facial recognition. Here we have a library of stored recognized visual images. For the visual system to fully work, both streams need to be highly integrated and share information. For individuals with CVI, there is damage somewhere along the visual pathways, which makes it harder for the brain and the eye to visually recognize and understand the world. At Perkins, we use a framework that is rooted in current research and informed by leading theorists in the field and our work with many kids and young adults with CVI. We look at 16 visual behaviors and compensatory skills, which are strategies and techniques that allow individuals with visual impairments and CVI the ability to access and better understand their world. This framework is evolving and will continue to follow the science and what we learn from people with CVI. We use this framework as a basis for all our work at the CVI Center, including creating our new Perkins CVI assessment tool called the Perkins CVI Protocol, which assesses how CVI impacts access to learning, the environment, safe navigation, social skills, and independence. So let's get into the visual behaviors. Visual attention. Visual attention is the ability to look at something which occurs when the eyes fixate on an object or a target in the environment. Visual attention looks different for each individual with CVI. Sometimes an individual may be visually aware of an item but not look directly at the item. They may look briefly, or they may be able to look directly at the item for a longer period of time. There can be factors that impact visual attention. For many, internal states, such as how they feel before or after a seizure, and external stimuli such as noise in the environment can disrupt visual attention. It also may be easier to gain your child's visual attention to something that is very familiar or highly motivating. Visual attention is a prerequisite for visual recognition. Visual recognition. Visual recognition is the ability to recognize an item just by looking at it. It involves comparing what you see to what you have stored in your visual memory. For example, does your child recognize a highly familiar toothbrush only in the context of the bathroom, or can they recognize their familiar toothbrush on the kitchen table? For individuals with CVI, visually recognizing an item can be difficult, so a child might rely on other strategies known as compensatory skills. For example, many parents report that their children with CVI can recognize a toy, but it is only once the sound is turned on that the child demonstrates recognition of that toy. For many with CVI, the brain struggles to build a strong visual memory. Even if something is added to the visual memory, recognizing different versions of it can be very hard. This is why routines, repetition, and familiarity are crucial for learning. Form accessibility. Form accessibility involves the types of visual materials that are most accessible. For example, can the individual most easily recognize real 3D objects or images or print? If images are most ideal, what do these images look like? Can they recognize real photographs or abstract images? Are color images easier to recognize than black and white images? Individuals with CVI have varying abilities to see and understand these materials in different forms. Realistic materials are often easier to understand than cartoon-like or symbolic ones. It's important to remember that just because someone with CVI looks at something doesn't mean that they understand it. For example, does your child recognize a family pet, perhaps a dog? What might help them recognize your dog? Does your child need to hear the barking, the patter from their paws, or touch their fur? Or can your child visually recognize the dog? If you were to show your child a photograph of the dog, do they recognize the photo as your dog? What if you were to show your child an abstract image of a cartoon dog? Would they still recognize that as a dog? Response interval. For some living with CVI, it may take longer for them to process. It's important to evaluate the length of time that it takes an individual to become visually aware of a target, to look at the item, and then to recognize it. We must give our children the time they need to visually process. It's important to be silent and patient and give our children the opportunity to locate and recognize items. Many with CVI notice highly saturated colors more than others and recognize items based on their color. For example, does your child look more quickly at items of a certain color or colors? Does color help them to recognize a familiar item? For example, my daughter knows the color of her familiar piano, so the color orange helps her to recognize it. What if you presented two items in the same color and overall shape? Do they have the visual skills needed to differentiate between the two items? It's also important to keep in mind that if your child's contrast sensitivity is reduced, color can support visual attention when presented in contrast. Impact of light. Impact of light refers to the awareness and attention to light sources, such as a lamp, a bright window, or a backlit screen. Some individuals may be very visually drawn to light, while others may have photophobia, avoiding light sources and fatiguing quickly when presented with lighted materials. When my daughter was younger, she would stare at lights so much that we called the lights her friends. It's important to remember that light can both help and hinder people with CVI, either improving or reducing their ability to focus and visually recognize information. Impact of motion. When looking at the impact of motion, we're considering the individual's visual attention when motion is present. Some of our children with CVI might need an object to be gently moved from side to side to help them look. Others may be distracted by motion in the environment, such as siblings or caregivers moving about in the room. It can also be difficult for an individual to follow a fast-moving object. For example, a dog or a ball tossed in their direction. This can lead to safety implications, such as accurately judging the distance and speed, such as a driving car or a moving swing on the playground. It's important to remember that motion can help them to look, but it can also be really distracting for an individual with CVI. Visual field abilities. Visual field abilities refer to the individual's ability to respond to items in a particular visual field. Sometimes the child uses their peripheral vision to notice items out of the corners of their eyes, and sometimes they may look directly at an item using their central vision. Some people with CVI may also have an ocular impairment that impacts their ability to use their visual fields. For example, they may have a visual deficit on one side, which results in paying more attention to items in their other visual field. Individuals with CVI can have a range of visual deficits, depending on where the damage or interruption is located in the brain. Visual curiosity. Many of us learn a lot by simply seeing what is happening around us. Visual curiosity is the ability to learn incidentally by observing and visually understanding the world around you. This includes noticing things both near and far, in familiar and new places. For example, does your child look with curiosity while you cook in the kitchen, or perhaps when you explore a toy aisle at the store? So what about those living with CVI? Many with CVI struggle to see things both up close and far away, reducing their incidental learning, thus decreasing their ability to know what is happening around them. What distance do you notice that is best for your child to visually notice something? What if you present outside of this distance? Are they still curious or aware of the item? Or does this seem to no longer exist? Visual curiosity might be impacted by different environments, such as how familiar or noisy the environment is. Impact of clutter and crowding. Clutter is one of the greatest barriers to access for individuals with CVI. Some may only see one item at a time. and have difficulty when multiple items are in front of them. Backgrounds can be a barrier for our children with CVI. For example, think about your child using a mobility device such as a stander or a wheelchair. Is their tray clear or patterned? Have you ever tried a black background? What if the background was solid? Does this support your child's ability to locate an item? As a medical mom, I know my house is filled with extra equipment and items my daughter uses daily. This also adds environmental clutter to my home, but this is something I try to consider at all times. We do our best to keep our daughter's space free of additional clutter. When she's in her activity chair, I present her with one item at a time on a solid colored tray, knowing that for her, multiple items increase clutter and she loses interest. Sensory integration. Sensory integration looks at how other senses like touch and hearing impact vision use. For individuals with CVI, using vision simultaneously along with other senses can be extremely challenging. You may notice your child struggling with using their vision while processing sounds or exploring an item with touch. Sometimes they may need to focus on just one sense at a time. For example, do you observe your child looking away from a favorite toy once the sound is on? When an environment is loud and busy, how does your child react? Are they still able to use their vision? Do you see them put their head down more? Many with CVI shut down or become overwhelmed when this environment has too many sensory inputs. Access to people. Some individuals with CVI may have difficulty or inability to look at faces, make eye contact, recognize faces, interpret facial expressions, and understand body language and gestures. Some families report that their child appears to look right through them. Think about your child. Does your child look at faces? Are those faces only familiar faces, such as a sibling or a caregiver? Is your child able to return a social smile? Do they ever mistake you for someone else? What seems to help your child recognize you? Do they rely on other senses or strategies to recognize you, such as hearing your voice? Although many of our kids are socially natured, difficulty with access to people can lead to the stress and anxiety and difficulty with social interactions and understanding facial expressions and social gestures. Visual guidance of upper limbs. Visual guidance of upper limbs is a motor skills involved with the hand-eye coordination, such as reaching accurately while looking. This can be hard for several reasons, including limited fine motor skills. You might also observe a sweeping, raking, or open hand motion while reaching, though your child may not be directly looking at the item. You may also observe your child looking at an item, but then they may look away while reaching for that item or interacting with the item. You may see your child misreach for an item. For individuals with reduced motor skills, consider using hand under hand to help your child explore materials. This consists of you gently placing your hand under the hand to help them reach and interact with items. Visual guidance of lower limbs. Visual guidance of lower limbs are the motor skills involved with foot-eye coordination, such as the child's ability to safely navigate their environment. Look while walking and notice and navigate changes in depth. This can be hard for several reasons, including limited gross motor skills. For example, have you noticed your child having difficulty crossing a threshold while crawling, scooting, or walking? Do they pause at changes in depth? Or do they fall often? Do they bump into items while walking or while using their wheelchair? Visual guidance of the lower limbs may be further impacted by clutter and motion in the environment, changes in light, and simultaneous auditory input. Appearance of the eyes. We look at the alignment and eye preference and if the child's eyes are working together. Are their eyes pointed straight ahead when looking at something, or does the one eye turn in while the other one turns out? Does the child favor or use one eye more than the other? This information is often validated by clinical optometry or ophthalmology examinations. Movement of the eyes. When looking at the movement of the eyes, we look at the way both the eyes move in different directions, horizontally, vertically, and diagonally. We also look at how the child shifts their gaze from one place to another. For example, if you hold up two choices, can your child look at both options by looking at one and then shifting their gaze to the other item? This information is often also validated by clinical optometry and ophthalmology examinations. Compensatory skills. Compensatory skills are strategies and techniques that allow individuals with CVI the ability to access and better understand their world. Some CVI compensatory skills include awareness of context, auditory cues, verbal cues, tactile cues, and exploration and color coding. All kids with CVI use compensatory skills. Learn more about CVI at cvinow.org and learn more about developmental and epileptic encephalopathies at deepconnections.net.